Architecture was not in the background. It's not a neutral space. It is, in fact, deeply interconnected. We see it all the time. It either enriches our lives or it takes away from our experiences. Sometimes people don't see that connection between the design and everything that we create is an outcome of a design process.
AI is changing how we design and the types of products we build. It's still unclear exactly what the future design looks like, but architecture reveals important lessons about how AI will transform the creative process and how it can improve the efficiency of major development projects.
We never stop to ask ourselves, what do we want to do with this time? So just because something took half the time it did before, what happened is we just did more. So we just filled the time we gained with more. We never stopped to say, hey, should I use this time for something else? Should I go on and do some other tasks? Is there something of higher and better use?
Matt Krissel, the co-founder of the Built Environment Futures Council, joins us to discuss how AI is disrupting architecture and lessons for digital product teams. He really struck powerful points many times during our conversation about questioning the role of time and permanence in a world where we want more, faster. In the conversation, we covered a lot of topics. Flipping the creative process on its head. Incremental growth is fine, but let's reimagine processes. What should we be doing with more productivity anyways? Getting punch drunk on complexity and novelty, and the value of modeling complex project operations.
The best work that I've seen emerges from that process, working through that uncertainty, towards that clarity, towards the pursuit of simplicity, which often has to go through a path of complexity, which for most people makes them very uncomfortable. That uncertainty around designing a future. So as an architect, I'm always 5-7 years out in the future. I live in a simulation of something that is yet to become. And that's really unsettling for some people to kind of live in that world and be able to simulate and debate.
Matt Krissel is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and a principal at Perkins & Will, a global interdisciplinary architecture and design firm. For over 2 decades, he has led transformative architecture projects across North America and internationally. His portfolio ranges from iconic, institution-defining buildings to small homes with big ideas. Drawing from his extensive work and deep interest in design technology, Matthew co-founded the Built Environment's Future Council in 2023. This diverse national group of designers and builders works to advance the discourse and opportunities for design, technology, and artificial intelligence in architecture and construction. He is also an adjunct faculty member at the Carnegie Mellon School of Architecture, where he works to help shape the next generation of design leaders.
For the most part of humanity, information has been highly scarce, and the few people that held it benefited from it. We now see ourselves in this time where it's absolutely completely abundant. In fact, there's too much. So the need to separate the vital few from the trivial many is becoming more important than ever.
Thank you for listening to Design of AI podcast. We provide a pragmatic and practical deep dive into what AI can do and how it is transforming industries. We help designers, researchers, and product managers excel in a rapidly changing future. If you find this strategic content helpful, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting app. It really helps us if you leave some reviews. And if you never want to miss an episode, make sure to go to our Substack. We'll be putting out a lot of strategic content, some recommendations, and ideas that'll help you. You can find that at designofai.substack.com.
Welcome, Matt. Architecture is something that's important to me. Architecture is a classical design field. It's something special. It's something people don't really understand. I understand it because I studied it. It was something I was really deeply passionate about. But then digital came along and really swept me away. People tend to forget how important architects were in the realm of creating spaces and communities and the way of life. What do you think has changed in terms of how we perceive architecture today and in the past? And are we taking it for granted?
Well, welcome. Thank you, Arfi. This is great. I'm glad to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. It is amazing because you have a bit of a background in architecture. Some of this may sound very familiar to you. When I think about this question around design and taken for granted, for sure, a lot of people, that is the case. I think architecture is often in the background. In our society, with the amount of resources we have, I'd like to think great design wouldn't be always sitting in the background. But for many people, they've never had a chance to work with an architect before. They haven't had the exposure to the architectural process. What's that like? There are a lot of people in society that, of course, invest in design, appreciate great design, whether it's product level. or otherwise. But it's a different scale in architecture and a different kind of connection. So whether the average person thinks about it this way or not, architecture is not in the background. It's not a neutral space. It is, in fact, deeply interconnected. We see it all the time. It either enriches our lives or it takes away from our experiences. It definitely shapes our actions, our emotions, that collective identity. We know that the quality of our life is shaped by the design that surrounds us. If we design the surroundings to be noisy and chaotic, low resolution, disconnected, we tend to live a noisy, chaotic, disconnected life. So it is kind of surprising to me sometimes when people get frustrated about the lack of function in a space or bored by the banality that surrounds them, but don't see that connection between the design and everything that we create, large and small, is an outcome of a design process that somebody did, right? Everything around us is engaged in it. So it's true. Our environment, our experiences reflect our investment in design. It reflects the values we stand for, the things we make become that manifestation of what we believe, where we want to go, who we are. And design truly, I believe, is the foundation of what we can accomplish.
I know when we think of architecture, our mind goes to classical architecture. It's very institutional buildings. It's big, grand palisades and grand plazas and all these kinds of crazy things. But in our modern world, if we go to 3 different malls, we'll feel the ambiance, the difference of those things. If we go to 3 university campuses, we really feel the difference of it. Can you give us some examples of what we've forgotten that architecture has done or the role it's played over the centuries?
Well, there's certainly the aspect of how it shapes the way we live, the way we work, the way we learn, the way we play. I think the sense that it does, in fact, touch us at multiple scales. A lot of people sense the house they grew up in, maybe the place they went to school, as you said, the context and the environment that they're around. But I think a lot of people don't quite feel that they have had a say in that, had a chance to participate in that process.
Something that's interesting about that, and one of the reasons I personally love architecture, is that typically there's quite a grand public consultation process. There is an examination of context and being in situ and understanding what the meaning of a place is. What do you love about architecture?
When I started out, when you're beginning, you don't get a lot of access to the client side, the user side. So it becomes all about process, a very kind of internally focused love, the challenge, the stretching yourself, the wrestling with ideas, seeing it all come into focus. As I gained experience and you build a few projects, and even more satisfactory is when you then, after the project's done, you go back a year or two later and talk to the people who use the spaces that you design. It's about the impact now that drives me. The process now becomes in service of that capacity to make positive change, capacity to improve that, like I said, how we live, work, learn, play, all those facets that can compound with a building. And of course, the buildings outlive us. So it's also what you leave behind. So that community engagement question, and it's something I will say in the last 10 to 15 years, I've seen a lot more community engagement and robustness at the front end of the design process, recognizing that it's this incredibly critical act of design. It's how we as architects start to build a sense of empathy, the listening, the creative friction that comes in testing ideas and shaping ideas through feedback. What you begin to learn when you do these enough is that you start to form this intuition around a project, that value of listening, observing, that staying open-minded, and how important it is to not come to a project with preconceived notions, to bring that kind of beginner mindset to every project. If possible, it's hard sometimes. If you do the same project typology over and over again, it can be a real challenge for some. I tend to like to work laterally, where I'm always putting myself in a position of something new and challenging. But that's really, really critical for that project inception, to have that open-mindedness relative to that engagement. So as architects, when we listen and observe, we also have to recognize we are still absolutely the expert in the room. Just because someone says something doesn't necessarily mean it's true or right, or in fact, what's best for the project in the totality of architecture, which tends to involve lots of people, lots of competing interests. The reality that I've come to learn, RP, that's also pretty interesting, is that a lot of people struggle to articulate what they need and want. They don't know yet. And you soon start to realize, as people talk about So for example, if I'm interviewing somebody and they are describing the constraints of the space they're in and we're designing a new building for them, it's very hard for a lot of people to not project those same constraints into a new building of which those constraints would not be an issue. So that sense of capacity to articulate what they need and want, don't quite realize the timing of in the design process of where that value is. Most people are not really equipped to organize those priorities when there's competition for space and resources, or to understand the knock-on effects of decisions that are made. And so much of design, great design, is that mix of trade-offs that we have to do, the give and take, as much as it is about originality. So the design team absolutely becomes this critical translator, becomes the fortune teller, right? Seeing more than what's actually being said, being able to push the boundaries of a project. I think some of the things that people may not realize architects do is we often rewrite the boundaries of a project when you start to get to know people in place, where the opportunities actually are. It may not have been outlined at the beginning. Again, if designers aren't in the room when a project is initially scoped. And this is probably in lots of industries, whether you're designing a website or a product, like we constantly, as a designer, you step back, are we even asking the right question? Are we starting in the right place? Is the project boundary even drawn right? So that capacity to bring the product to its fullest potential is something that you can't necessarily predict at the beginning. So the best work that I've seen emerges from that process, working through that uncertainty towards that clarity, towards the pursuit of simplicity, which often has to go through a path of complexity, which for most people makes them very uncomfortable. That uncertainty around designing a future. So as an architect, I'm always 5-7 years out in the future. I live in a simulation of something that is yet to become. And that's really unsettling for some people to kind of live in that world and be able to simulate and debate ideas and questions and how that changes the way you work or the way you live or what you're really capable of. So that open forum of the stakeholder engagement, that community engagement, that setting goals, debating ideas, that stretching ourselves, making people uncomfortable to sharpen our senses becomes a critical role in the action of a well-designed process for sure. And as you know, we need to gather all those parameters to build an infrastructure that enables us to effectively iterate throughout the whole stakeholder engagement. So
I'm sure a lot of the digital product designers listening are nodding their heads and they're a little jealous because they wish they could be working on the future and they wish they had a seat at the table all the time. In public discourse, there's always this vision of the architect as this rock star. You just need to read a couple children's books or watch a couple sitcoms, and the architect's always like this rock star of these multi-million-dollar projects. What's the reality in that world? Because I know product designers, they are always fighting for influence and they're always worried that they're not getting listened to. Is architecture the way that it's portrayed in public discourse?
I've been very fortunate. I've worked at incredible places that are working on the kind of projects that are extremely aspirational, that tend to be, people tend to seek out an architect for change. There are some people who deliver design services for status quo, right? Just give me another warehouse, please. I just need, so there is an aspect of a kind of service-oriented component to architecture that is about building more of the same, in which the design part is less kind of the driver, and it tends to be more the kind of technical competency and delivery. I've been very fortunate to be on that aspirational side. But just like anything, there's a mix. There are times and places where there is that sense of really being seen as a true expert, really, being valued for what we bring to the table, not just in drawing and representation, but in a way of thinking. So some of the best projects have been when you're early on in those early conversations, I realize the dialogue we're having, if I'm working at like an institution, I'm the only person who's maybe talked to everybody who's worked at a place. There's like 40 people working and they've never all talked to each other in a way that thinks about where they're trying to go. Like, so the process of setting goals, establishing the design drivers, the kind of where we want to go. I get compliments about like, wow, this really changed our strategic plan. Going through a master plan process with you has allowed us to rethink really what we can do, what we want to do. Sometimes it can elevate their expectations and aspirations. So that part is incredibly rewarding, but it still is something that, again, a lot of work happens in the world that doesn't even involve an architect. It's something like 90 to 95% of the housing doesn't even have an architect involved anymore. It's just spec housing. It's, the catalog item that was designed once and is now being repeated all over the place without any kind of consideration of place and context. So that part, I would say, as an architect, is really disappointing when we see the amount of resources and consumption that architecture has and buildings, the built environment has, to not have that design layer. So I want to see more, but yes, it's great to hear that, other people see it still as this very high level role in society that I certainly believe it has.
But again, everything you're saying, there's a similarity in what's happening in digital where the tools, the technology are enabling clients and organizations to push faster, get more done faster with less. And you talked about spec housing in digital. There are templates, there are design systems that enables us to literally generate and spin out variants or duplicates of things. What are some of the big disruptions happening in your world? Because I feel like there's going to be a lot of similarities between the two worlds, and we'd really like to learn from yours because the investment in yours is unbelievably huge.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if I go back to about 2 years ago, nearly 2 years ago, when all the sudden proliferation of Mid-Journey produced images that looked a lot like some form of architecture, right? This incredible anxiety in the architecture community suddenly came over us. I mean, when I look at a photorealistic image, the process of the old is one that I would see that image and I would see hundreds of hours of meetings, decisions, wrestling with ideas. A rendering like that is more at the end of a process, a culmination of a series of work. And so suddenly when you see something of this incredible fidelity at the beginning, we haven't even done anything. It causes you to question the whole process. What if you started at the end? If you started with atmosphere instead of the precision that we have as architects, where we start with a model, then we apply materials, and then you start to apply atmosphere, you apply furniture, the layers and layers over time of detail to get to that image. And if you start to invert that. So there certainly was a lot of anxiety a couple of years ago, a lot of buzz around, and now these are general purpose image generators. But then once you dig into it, you start to see that the suggestion of speed is just something that's fast, but not always good. It can be provocative, but not always very meaningful, seductive for sure, but maybe not that compelling when you really kind of dig into it. So the causality to the image, this organization of pixels that suggests something, you start to realize is just a sketch. It actually, a lot of it doesn't work, doesn't make sense. It doesn't have any sense of the actual place. But these less precise workflows that I'm describing that suddenly emerge, that cause a little bit of anxiety, it is pretty interesting to think about it as a set of provocations to expand thinking, to provide a new perspective, just to loosen you up a little bit, to elevate those qualitative expectations. Because if I can bring an image to the front of a project, even if it's not the thing itself, I can have a different conversation about setting goals and aspirations than I could before. The thing to remember with the architectural software community is it is a vast ecosystem that mixes general purpose tools and highly technical, complex, bespoke software. It takes years of training, right? And we rely on people right now to move across this incredibly messy landscape of methods. So the gains that I'm seeing right now in AI workflows are very incremental. They're in these silos and short bursts of productivity gains for the tools of today. There aren't a lot of solutions yet that are moving across the vastness of the ecosystem. When I think about like Grammarly and I'm sending a text message and it can read my text, and then I'm in Adobe InDesign or I'm on a slide deck and it's moving across an ecosystem of tools. There isn't quite a parallel that I've seen in the architecture community that can move across general purpose and these highly specific, unique digital workflows yet. So there's probably this continued incremental growth that'll happen. Or in the near future, the real benefits, I think, are going to come when we kind of reimagine the entire process. We're not just imagining right now, we're just kind of goosing up these existing convoluted ways. Again, it's nice. It's a little bit better, a little bit faster. That's great. But the whole new way of thinking and making that's possible. And there are some startups that are starting to dabble in the space, but the really big gains are going to happen. Those compounding gains and the new opportunities are really going to happen when there's a more radical rethink. So it's starting to happen. I think people are starting to experiment in that, but there's a seriousness to the work of architecture that makes it challenging. There's a vastness to this landscape, this ecosystem that's challenging. But I can share with you a couple things, that I'm seeing that I think will be interesting. So, and some of the things that I'm kind of excited about more so than others. There are folks who are really taking on a collaboration how you move between drawing, modeling, reviewing, iterating, presenting, and communicating, those facets of the design process, to me, it's more compelling when they're targeting those kind of interactions. I've seen firms that are creating chatbots, right, that are leveraging natural language interface to wade through internal documents, knowledge management structures. People are going after how do we kind of improve that. Similarly, we have people that are bracketing training models for images and image diffusion generators through AI processes, where you're able to train it on your own work, so you can kind of bracket it a little bit. You don't have to rely on the kind of morass of the Mid-Journey process and where it's getting all that information and data from. You can control that for ideation, for remixing. In architecture, there are firms that are forming these consortiums to create what are described as data lakes, where you have multiple firms that would pool data together. So one of the things with architecture is there actually isn't huge amounts of data, kind of firm to firm, or certainly small practices to really leverage, let's say, machine learning that wants huge amounts of data. So the conversations happening, well, what if there were collaborations and people pooled data to be able to advance certain ideas? That could be compelling and interesting. The other one that I'm seeing is starting to combine visualization and simulation data workflows so that we're not continuing to see an image of what the space would look like as one exercise, and then all the performance data that would go into it, thermal comfort, the lighting, all those other elements, starting to see those collapse so that when we're internally working through, we're seeing at the same time a simultaneity of performance and the kind of look and feel visualization of the final outcome. That's interesting to me. One of the ones I've been thinking about, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this as well, is how can we start to integrate hand drawing with computational workflows or quick physical models in architecture, whether it's clay or foam, into these high fidelity modeling, simulation, visualization workflows. I'm really intrigued by this idea, these more informal acts of creativity and how they get layered into the computational workflows. It will draw in more people. In architecture, it's such a long career. You've got people who generation of architects that have never used a computer to do a 3D model before. They were trained before that and have never had a chance to use it. There's an immense amount of knowledge and wisdom that if we had a different, simpler way to flow into that, could be really compelling. There's a speed and dexterity to the work of those informal acts, a whiteboard sketch, a tablet sketch. And to me, this idea of how we nurture ideas, there's a fuzziness to that pace of hand drawing or model making that plays an important role in ideation. How we infuse our sensibility, our judgment, empathy, our intuition that large language models, diffusion models just can't do yet. I mean, it's not trained on the emergent ideas that are swirling in my head right now, right? This like real time moment of that kind of burstiness that happens when you're getting excited about a design idea. How do you quickly get that into that flow, right? To me, there's something about the hand component to that. So when I think about writers who talk about the value of writing to clarify ideas, that the act of writing is bringing clarity. And so they write and then it gets bloated and they edit. And then it gets bloated and they edit. And that concept back until you can really distill something down, that the clarity of the idea comes from that act of writing and editing, writing. And that's very similar for architects too. The drawings, the visualization isn't just a representation of a recipe. We're not just thinking of it and then just applying it. There is something about the kind of intentionality for shaping ideas that drawing helps form, that creative connection that comes from the emergent process that one can't quite articulate the same way in a prompt, for example, at the beginning of something. You can't describe what you don't know yet. So there's something really beautiful about the idea of moving between these ways of creativity that I'm really excited about.
Undeniable. Now, you use the analogy of the kitchen for a second there, right? And, you ask questions about how you could or might leverage AI. And there's a couple of facets that are being discussed that heavily. So number one is, okay, how can we equip the executive chef to have more control, more oversight? There's obviously operational gains that can happen there. But the net outcome of that is fewer staff. The other one is how can we equip them with new tools to change the way they work, give them more variation, change the menu on a daily basis. And that's wonderful. But again, one of the potential outcomes is fewer people ultimately doing the work. Versely, if you go and say, how can I support the saucier or the line cook to have more impact, it may ultimately result in fewer executive chefs. So there's an interesting parallel happening in all the creative fields and all the product fields, really, because this technology is changing how we work, but it's also changing the types of products that we're ultimately creating. And I think that that is one of the challenges in this entire field, because we can get very caught up in how it can help us, but there are downstream effects and unintended consequences that I feel perhaps we're not exploring. In your field, what do you see existing as consequences or potential consequences coming soon from this shift in design?
I would say it still feels like we're very much on the cusp of disruption, more so than seeing this kind of holistic vision of where this is all going to go. There's still way more questions than answers. It feels like we're kind of hacking and hot rodding more than seeing a clear path forward, right? We're still kind of cobbling things together. When I think about this question of people and volume of people, this very much gets to, well, here, I'll give you an example. In the early days of the transition so in the late 90s, early 2000s in architecture, you had 2D CAD drawing. So we'd already gone through the transition from hand drawing to using computers. And it's primarily 2D. 3D was still very labor intensive. And what happened in the late 90s and early 2000s, we began to see, really led through academia, but it started to bleed into the profession, this expanded mind, this new production capacity was being leveraged for, let's say, gratuitous form making, this obsession with image, getting kind of punch drunk on the novelty of complexity. And it all obscured the opportunity to broadly educate the next generation and orient this new speed, this new elastic mind that these computational workflows were driving towards the capabilities to think bigger, to go deeper, tackle different types of problems, and how do we drive towards more meaningful outcomes. So in my opinion, that set us back probably 10 years of just like getting that out of our system. And it created these incredibly seductive images and really interesting things, but it didn't really move humanity forward, right? It became an obsession around the kind of image. So what I don't want to see as a profession is where we repeat that mistake. And we're seeing something similar here with this obsession with image making in the early days of AI and over-indexing on the aesthetic, this kind of new banality where everything's looking the same. The opportunity here is really to, I think, recenter on some of those things that matter, the quality, the impact, the usefulness, and aesthetics, this idea that it has to be one and not the other. So I do think it's going to allow us to expand the kind of things that we can do, which will really be, I think, important and vital. But if we return to that kind of quick and easy kind of critique, where we're just kind of making an image, calling it a day, we do need to become more advocates for a richer, more compelling space for the experiences that benefit all of us that come through that process. So our human capacity to expand the fullness of the project's potential, to diverge before we converge, ensure we ask the right questions. When you think about the history of innovation, two things that have killed great ideas more than almost anything is you didn't ask the right questions and you converged too quickly, right? So I think about the judgment, the editing, the legibility in our built environment, situational intelligence, just how vital that is to that.
That late 90s era was definitely the era where I worked in architecture, and I was a CAD monkey. That was it. And I'm assuming that job doesn't exist anymore. I would assume it's been replaced by something else. But when I hear what you're talking about, I'm just constantly asking myself, okay, these tools can really change how we work, maybe what we create. But this question of impact, how would you like to leverage these technologies to have more impact, where you know that it's contributing to the community, where it's helping? Because if anything, our world seems more divisive. And as a result of it, there's more questions than there are answers on things when there's a design being proposed or some way of life being shifted in communities. It's how can we use these technologies to bridge that?
The issues that face our industry are not because architects cannot make a provocative image quickly. Right? It's not for lack of ideas. It's holding us back from a better built environment. So this idea of the speed to market, and it has to be more than just traditional optimization and efficiency pursuits. It has to be this multidimensional approach about what creates the space for us to not get squeezed out of that creative act. Instead, we want to find ways that the ruling for the new version of what design is and becomes is a more symbiotic relationship with computation, generative AI, and the human layer. So that value argument is essential to just not the hyper optimization that one might see, which is the one that kind of starts to squeeze people out. So all those things I talked about before, that value of cultural, the kind of personal, the wisdom, the judgment, the taste, that situational intelligence of just people and place, all that conversation around the community input. And what I've learned is that so much comes from the back and forth and interaction that it's really hard to imagine, at least in the current workflows, how that our role in that creative process is just completely eliminated. Could we get to something where it's then totally different? I mean, one of the things probably we do have to start to confront as a profession is ask ourselves, what are some things we're willing to let go of? If we're going to say yes to something else, we have to say no to something. And there is this moment of reshuffling about where is our time best spent? How are we at our best? There are significant challenges that would be far better. So the things that we already do well, I'm not sure I'm interested in seeing those just suddenly get optimized out. And I understand why. We start with these image generators. They are very splashy. They're very exciting. But to me, the real challenges are the technical sides of architecture, right? It's the coordination. It's helping people de-risk the aspects of design and construction, right? So if we think about like the construction industry, it's an incredibly fragmented industry. It's lots of small firms, lots of small sub-consultants. It's historically resisted a lot of technological adaptation because you tend to have to go to the lowest common denominator. All these people have to come together and flow into a construction site and get coordinated across that. Construction is highly risk adverse. There's huge safety and financial exposure. There is a history of resistance to change on the construction side. And the industry relies on those manual methods, right, of how things have always worked. But construction projects also are about one-offs. It's really hard to systematize and scale technology in the world of construction where every site is different, every user is different. There's not a lot of repetition. So some of the more positive examples you see is in the world of prefabrication, where you'll see under certain conditions where there is more systematized opportunities, you'll see robots and humans working in harmony. You'll see digitally driven fabrication in really beautiful ways. Those start to give you a really great glimpse of what that more symbiotic relationship might look like. So in construction, the tech adoption absolutely has been slow, but the imperative is huge. The cost, the resources, the consumptions that buildings now is just crushing our capacity to deliver on housing, institutional, commercial work, whatever sector you want to talk about. It's all getting squeezed. And what happens is quality drops, right? And this is the net loss to society is when quality and resilience, the ability for our buildings to adapt, withstand, recover. And we think of architecture on a 100-year timeline. So out of the gate, you're thinking, how does this last at least 100 years? If quality gets squeezed out of that process, it's a real impact and downfall for society. So that's a critical element of how we begin to kind of reimagine that.
Let's add a provocation here. I love that expression from the design world, but technology historically has done one thing very well, and it's made design more disposable. It's easier to make repeatable designs that don't last. But sometimes society needs disposable infrastructure. Sometimes it needs more faster. And in a housing crunch, that is one such situation. The technology also, as it gets more complex, can enable us to create more complex products. How can we live in a world where we have to balance these two things? Like, are there benefits to having more disposable design and having more complex design, or does that just create like a two-tier world of some sort?
I actually believe there is emerging pathways for the kind of productization of parts of architecture. Housing is a good one where we can start to bring aspects of the systematization of it, be able to pre-design certain elements that certainly work. I mean, I think in the vastness of architecture, there's a few really high-end things. There's some low-end stuff. Most of architecture sits just kind of average. And one of the things, when we want to think about the measure of impact, we want to have significant impact. How do you go after that middle space? Because that's the proliferation of so much happening. So what I'm excited about, this opportunity, this new relationship to time, to reshift our workflows, the way we are going to think and make, is to kind of go after that middle space. This idea that we can bring technical competency up to an entirely new baseline level So even if the averaging of a lot of things that happen through these workflows kind of dulls at one level, it can actually bring, let's say, suboptimal work up to a totally new level that I think would be very positive. So in terms of how we start to just build better and smarter, certainly for the average project, that would be a huge gain for reducing material waste, energy use, the carbon impact across the huge vast of stuff. If we're building 1.5 million homes around the country a year that are happening with or without great design or great architecture overlay, how do we at least start to just have that impact on the construction side, on the cultural side of how we position material use and the kind of performance side of architecture? So there absolutely is a strand that can learn a lot from the kind of product side of development. There is a role for that. There is still huge parts of architecture and buildings that need to have that tunability to the specificity of site and people. And that's where it starts to get interesting, is that you start to blend ideas of a systematized approach with how you bring custom elements in. Because some of the most critical parts, that the critique of the spec house that gets designed once, you see a house in Phoenix that looks the same as a house in Massachusetts. And you're like, what the heck? One's in the desert and one's in the Northeast. It's preposterous to continue to build that way.
You mentioned construction. So construction is one of the biggest industries in the world and in the US. And you are one part of that product line overall. What kinds of incentives and innovations do you see happening in the productization of construction that perhaps might have some interesting lessons for what we're doing in digital?
When we think about construction, there's a lot of reasons why construction has lagged. If you just think about 25 years ago, the year 2000, if you walked up to a construction site and you tapped the shoulder of a carpenter and you could teleport them to 2025 and they landed at a job site, everything would still feel very familiar to them. There's a set of drawings rolled out on a table and a construction trailer. The tools look about the same. The batteries are a little better, right? The job safety is probably a little bit better. There's maybe a few new things, but they generally you could just drop them in 25 years later and they just get to work, right? There's been a lot of people who have experimented with this. Boy, it seems like a ripe industry for significant change. A couple of the things that we start to see in the context of AI-driven workflows, there's been discussion, for example, around digital twins. This idea that you have a high fidelity model, the full construction process, and the final building, which has been talked about for years, but between the hardware, the software, and all the stuff that stitches it together hasn't quite all come together. We're seeing that convergence now. Think about all the kinematics that happen on a job site. The crane movements, materials coming and going, people flows. If you could start to simulate that, as opposed to right now, it's based on someone's been doing this for 50 years. We'll put the crane over there. We're going to run the concrete pour sequences left to right, top to bottom. Here's the schedule of that. Let's bring all the trucks in here to drop off materials over there. It's very intuition-based and experience-based. But if you could simulate that in a way that you could run thousands of permutations in advance that completely re-optimize all the movements of a job site, if you could get to the fidelity where everything is understood in terms of its exact size and tolerance, that you could change what you could do off-site versus on-site, or you just reimagine the on-site construction process in a very different way. There is huge opportunities in just the logistics of a job site, especially for large projects. Think of hospitals, airports, schools, things like that. Very complex, tons of people and material moving around. There's a lot of conversation around scheduling along with the sequencing, the huge part of how we're going to compress the time. So the things that are driving some of the construction costs are just how long it takes and the complexity of all the labor and materials. So the cost question, how we bring better cost information, the labor impact into the design process. So it's not always a resultant that happens years after the design's done, which is if you're on an 8-year project, you're designing for 2 to 3 years and you're building for 5 years. The cost of when you buy something is 5 years out from the when you designed it. Oh, the world changes a lot. So it's very hard to manage that information across time. So there's significant gains in how we bring that information, either foreground it differently or how we work with it on the background. So that speed question, it can be really, let's say, counterproductive if it's just all hyper optimization and everything just becomes this banal kind of diagram of the most efficient thing ever. But there is significant gains relative to the time, cost, and delivery of how we build and how we design, for sure.
It's interesting you brought that up because it sounds like a wonderful use case for this kind of computational power. But a consistent thing that we've learned, it doesn't matter what organization you are or what field you're in, these tools need you to have documentation of what you do, what's good, what's bad, some way to reinforce the learning of that activity. But when we think of a construction site or a big digital product firm, whether it's like an Amazon or whatever, there's very rarely the data sharing that's necessary to make this level of computation. What kind of incentive or what kind of path is there forward for us to start thinking so quantitatively about things that have always traditionally been about people and feelings?
A lot of architecture is actually unstructured data. There's structured data, which everyone can kind of grab and use, but there's an awful lot. That situational intelligence term I use, that sense of like, oh yeah, there's a column grid and one column is moved off and only one person knows it. Well, it's because in 20 years when you go to replace the air handler unit, someone's going to pull this big piece of equipment out and that's how a truck's going to get in and get that. But that doesn't sit anywhere in a drawing or a model, that information, right? It's just kind of in our head. It becomes the stories we tell about a place that gets passed forward. So there is an enormous amount of unstructured data. And that's going to be one of the ripe areas of innovation is how do we start to both either give it some structure or create the workflows that allow that reality, which just might exist for a while. It might be quite a while, right? So this 5 to 10 year period between, let's say, something really, truly spectacular that's reimagined all this. But in the period right now, how do we make use of both the tools we have or this near future horizon of what we'd like to see flow in that can take some of the situational realities we're working with and start to adapt them in different ways? So that's the part where I'm excited about is how do you redesign that future of practice, the future of construction, but the complexity, the vastness of the people and the range of skill sets, the tools required, it suggests there's an incremental path that's going to be in this short term. And then there's probably something really big that's sitting on the outside that at some point is just going to leapfrog all that. Because at some point, I think the incrementalism approach, as I mentioned before, these little siloed bursts of productivity is great to a point, but I'm not sure it's going to get us over the really big hurdles, the really big gains that we need to radically change why it costs so much to build a building, why our buildings just can't adapt and change over time the way that we might like or hope or frankly need it to be, that sense of resilience as we go into the future.
Let's talk about radical change then. If we were to focus explicitly on that goal of better community impact, cost focus, design as a language, what could or should we be doing to push that forward with this kind of technology in play?
I would say the optimism and concerns are very similar in architecture across lots of these creative fields. We're kind of still very much at this beginning. Things are coming into focus, but this wide spectrum of possibilities is something we have to see that as a feature and an opportunity, not just getting completely overwhelmed at the vastness of where this all might go. For the most part of humanity, information has been highly scarce, and the few people that held it benefited from it. We now see ourselves in this time where it's absolutely, completely abundant. In fact, there's too much. So the need to separate the vital few from the trivial many is becoming more important than ever. And so this, to me, is foregrounding the importance of how we synthesize, how we read between the lines, how we grasp the intangibles, how we leverage our personal experience, that situational intelligence, that taste, that judgment, our intuition, knowing when to break the rules and when to use constraints as something generative, which is, again, hard to imagine how you script that, how you kind of program that kind of versatility, but I'm sure it will come. But these are all qualities and attributes that right now are not part of an AI-only driven workflow. And arguably, these human attributes will only become more valuable, certainly in this short term. But to me, this is a time to be very opportunistic, right? The significant shifts in the tools, the mindset, the cultures of creativity and delivery that's happening right now. The question I keep asking myself is, how will we design it? How will we guide it? How will we leverage it towards co-intelligence is how I like to think of it, where yes, designers are still essential to that creative loop. And it allows us to expand in new territories and capabilities. But, is this an evolution? Is it a revolution? It's probably both. in that incremental path, and there's probably going to be something that's going to leapfrog this for sure. But we are changing our relationship to time, as I mentioned. And so we have to ask, what do we want to do with this? Because I think that's going to change the culture around a lot of this. In the world of architecture that I'm sure will resonate is in, I would say, 2005 to 2015, we saw a rapid change in visualization. So again, the confluence of hardware and software and moving from, let's say, novel to normalized workflows that were happening in the world of visualization and architecture. It would be something that would take a week, to produce, let's say, 2 renderings. It would take me a week. And then we saw that you could do those 2 renderings in 3 days, then you could do them in 1 day. And now we're at the point where it's essentially instantaneous. So we have these incredibly robust models that we can walk around in like a VR environment. And the graphics card is almost instantaneously rendering out the lighting, the materials, everything. But what I remember from being like you in that position of early stages of my career, where I was the one doing all the drawing and modeling and visualization, we never stopped to ask ourselves, what do we want to do with this time? So just because something took half the time it did before, what happened is we just did more, right? So we just filled the time we gained with more and more and more and more and more. We never stopped to say, hey, should I use this time for something else? Should I go on and do some other tasks? Is there something of higher and better use? So this idea of everything driven through this kind of more, sure, I suspect that somewhere along the line, the designs got better. I could create 8 views instead of 4 or 12 views. I could see things I wasn't seeing before. There's no doubt the design got better to a point. There's also a point, I suspect, that somewhere along there was diminishing returns. We were just doing more because we could, not that it was actually yielding anything better. So to me, how companies answer this question, what are we going to do with this time gained, will start to define their culture and their product. Will you just fill it with more? Are you going to focus on fewer but better? Increase your quality? Are you going to spend more time on business development or some entrepreneurial side hustle? Will you just go home early? What you decide to do as we start to gain productivity time is, I think, going to shape a lot of where some of this is all happening. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I would say it's not clear yet, the exact path, but we definitely know the general direction. We know we need to move towards something where our fellow designers need to, I would say, embrace our agency and design the future.
That's absolutely wonderful. Now, you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of people who are in operational design roles. What can be done to elevate them and their work? Is there any way to inspire them or challenge them or shift culture of that type of work?
Well, I think when I just broadly think about, say, culture and aspirations, you might just step back and say, what is the change that we seek to make? How do we start to ground ourselves in these kind of first principles and do the work to find out what we want to do more of and what we want to do less of? So it's not that helpful to start with designing the replacement of the things we already do really well, that we enjoy doing, that we bring great value. As I said, the automation and productivity boosts are great. Let's start with the areas of those real aspects of impact. And that, I think, that de-risking some of design, improving communication, elevating that technical competency we talked a little bit about before, that's a way that I think starts to create this kind of space for something more thoughtful to happen, to change the aspirations for a more kind of well-designed and resilient future. We don't need more goofy form-making apps. We want to augment our design intelligence. Some of that is the business model, and some of that, RP, is, of course, the culture we're in. That goes back to, in some ways, your first question about the value of design. Do people see it as something essential to creating a great society? There is always going to be a space for really simple and basic. So not everything needs to be some groundbreaking, world-changing thing. But I think every project, to me, there's an opportunity to make a positive change somewhere in there in terms of the material use, the responsibility, to the site integration, to the usefulness, to what it just puts into the world in that timescale again of it outliving us. When you really take that in and appreciate that we're leaving something behind and the flexibility it needs. So even simple things can have, I think, more design intelligence. So hopefully the capacity to change our relationship to time and what we do and what we want to do and what we want to do less of can create that space for bringing a different strand of aspiration. Isn't always about aesthetics, but can be about performance and function and things that will bring different value to it.
When we think about responsibilities and community and engagement and legacy, one of the things that my mind runs to, and one of the concerns I have, is in the tech sphere, we're developing and designing a lot of products to ship them as quickly as possible with as little engagement, user research as possible. We're just shipping product. And some of these products are going to have consequential impacts on communities and roles and such. How do you feel about that happening in tech? Do you have any reflections of that? Because I'm sure the same thing is happening in construction.
Well, we're still determining exactly all this nascent change. How is this all going to manifest itself in this near and extended future? I do think we want to prevent the hardware and the software and the features from leading the way. So I don't want to, like I said, inherit a design process designed by technology in search of a customer, because then it just becomes all about, or becomes less about what we need and want, and becomes more about what the software can do. Right? We don't need software in search of a problem to solve. So that great Peter Drucker quote, something like, there's nothing so useless as doing efficiently, it was something that shouldn't have been done at all. Right? So efficiency, when people just focus on optimizing without ever asking, is this the right thing to even be optimizing? Efficiency should not be the only goal. Right? Sometimes we can get caught up in that. The challenges are so profound. And we're just trying to find a calculator, just something that can just speed us up a little bit. So eliminating the drudgery and tedium in our work is useful, but that's not enough. That's a kind of incremental approach. In part because it can be too easily misguided. We need to search for that root cause of the deep friction. We all want to be more effective at what we do, and we want to be smart with how we work, but it's okay that some things are inefficient. Design is inherently inefficient, and in some ways that's a strength, not necessarily a thing to fix. Some things need more time. Sometimes you need to sit with things for a little while to really appreciate if it's heading in the right direction. Just racing to a finish line sometimes can create something very efficient, but then it isn't what we all really wanted or needed, especially with how difficult it is in the world of architecture to describe what you really need and want. And when you're thinking along a long time span, what does the world really need for something that's going to outlaw all of us? It's that quick first thing. You need that time to edit, to refine, right? So in these times, I would say, of rapid change, these fuzzy outlines, the uncertainty that we're all operating within, I think that the other way I'd like to describe it is be really clear on vision, but just stay loose on the details. The tech is going to change in unpredictable ways. The timelines are going to shift. I want to stay really focused on what really matters. I want fellow designers and architects and builders to embrace that agency, be the change makers, design the future that we know we can do. We can design our tools and workflows more proactively. I think we have to start to see it as an investment, not as oh my God, this is just happening and you're just trying to keep your head above water, but something that people need to be actively invested in now. So we have a moment here. Yes, things are happening really fast around us, but it's not changing tomorrow. I still get an RFP for a project that still sounds very traditional. Like the things I got to deliver, 2D drawings, and I've got to have a meeting every week with a client. There's still things happening around us, but we've got a little time here to start to build the relationships, experiment, design the culture and the mindset within your place to really start to leverage that change that is happening around us now. I want to see people start to design the future of practice and make it your own culture, what a design firm can and should be.
So Matt, where is a great place for people to learn about your work or some of the most innovative ideas and changes happening in architecture?
Well, certainly at my company, perkinsandwill.com, doing incredible work around the world. I have a personal site, Creative Lab 3. I've got a couple of essays I've published on some of these topic areas. I've got more writing I should do. I try to track some of my public speaking that I'm doing there. I did co-found an organization that we spent about 1.5 years on this topic, the Built Environment Futures Council. We set up a website. There's questions on there. So thebefc.org. Kind of questions we're asking. This is a national futures council around artificial intelligence in practice. So if you want to see some of the questions that architects are asking, there's a space there. Also on LinkedIn, I try to stay current with what's happening.
Amazing. It was a real pleasure to hear the future of architecture from you.
Great. Thank you. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And an important one.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We're on a mission to collect examples of how you're using AI to elevate your work. Share your examples at designof.ai. This episode was hosted by Arpi Drag-Figueredo, founder and principal strategist at PH1 Research. Please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. You can find it at designofai.substack.com.